Hello and welcome to the 11th episode of Raising Capital 101. I'm Tom Voekler and I'm joined today by Chip Cunningham and Rhys James. Both are partners at Williams Mullen, and we are going to discuss various aspects of a private offering, such as compensation for fundraising and what an intrastate versus interstate offering is. So we always have a big issue that comes up as to who can be compensated for raising capital and how can they be compensated. Chip, you want to tell us a little bit about what is considered compensation for raising funds?
Sure, Tom. Classic example is going to be you have a third party engaged exclusively to help the fund raise capital, and the fund pays that party a commission, generally a percentage amount of the securities sold in cash. And that's just plain vanilla broker-dealer compensation. But it can be less obvious than that, such as you have a situation where the fund has an employee. That employee is tasked with finding investors and building the fund's investment network. If that's what the employee mainly does, that person's salary would also likely be considered compensation for raising funds. So it's not always so obvious as the classic example.
Yeah, it can be confusing as to what is compensation for raising funds. Rhys, what is the issue if we were to pay somebody to raise some funds?
Well, the issue is that at both the federal and state level in the U.S., raising funds for compensation is regulated. Focusing on federal level, under Section 15 of the Exchange Act, if someone's going to get paid to raise capital for another party, they're generally going to have to register as a broker or a dealer in securities. If they're an individual, they'll have to become a registered representative of a licensed broker dealer. And if they don't do that, there are a few extraordinarily narrow exemptions that they could fall into if they want to get paid to raise capital. But generally speaking, you got to be licensed.
That makes it a little more difficult if you just, are hiring somebody internal and they don't have a license. So we hear this a lot, Chip, right? I've got a friend. He's got a huge Rolodex. He's got a contact list, and they're all potential investors, and he can introduce you to all of them, but obviously we'd like to get a little payment for that.
It's a common inquiry. Look, as Rhys said, if they're licensed, then that checks a lot of the compliance boxes, but probably 99 times out of 100, that person doesn't have a license. And so if not, it's going to be difficult to get comfortable with that person's not engaging in broker-dealer activity. If they were just handing off a list for a fixed price, maybe that falls into one of those narrow exceptions that Rhys mentioned, but it's always going to be facts and circumstances. But really, if the person's involved with introducing and has some role, it's going to be really hard to get away from the concern that the regulators have that person has a salesman's stake in selling those securities and should be under some regulatory scrutiny.
So what happens if this friend of yours is also an established, real estate person that could really help you with other aspects of the business, maybe would spend the majority of the time helping you with finding investment opportunities, rather than just bringing his Rolodex in? Does that change anything?
Yeah, it could. Certainly the person having substantive duties aside from his or her role with building an investment network could, again, facts and circumstances, and it really has to be a very minor portion of what that person is doing as an employee. And there are the safe harbor out there that funds can look to for those types of employees and try to wedge them in. But if they fall outside that safe harbor, it's not necessarily fatal, but it's a space that you really don't want to play in.
So we get asked a lot. We have to hire for investor relations. We have a lot of investors calling in, whether they're new investors or whether they're existing investors. Sometimes that role is going to be kind of more clerical and just, maybe taking in paperwork or pushing out some updates. Is there kind of a line, or is it a gray area, or what do we look for?
Sure. Well, as with most items in the law, there are lines and there are gray areas. So first and foremost, like Chip was alluding to, if you've got someone that you bring in, kind of regardless of what function they're performing, if they're getting paid directly or indirectly with respect to soliciting transactions in securities, then they're going to be likely considered to be engaging in brokerage activity. If you go to the other end, if you bring in someone whose job is just to answer the phone when the investor calls and tell them where they can find the subscription agreement, and that person's not getting paid based on sales, sales, they're likely going to be inside part of the safe harbor that Chip was alluding to. And there are some bright lines in the safe harbor from brokerage activity at the federal level for folks who are engaged in clerical activities, who are engaged solely in responding to investor inquiries, not initiating them, right, but responding to them, and folks that are otherwise, preparing communications that don't involve solicitations. So there are some boxes you can be in as a clerical or investor relations person, but you've got to be careful you don't step outside of those without really engaging in a hard facts and circumstances analysis of what the role really entails and what the compensation for the role is.
Seems like I'm hearing a lot from both of you two, facts and circumstances. I think this is where we can plug ourselves as experts in the area to help you navigate through these types of issues. Chip, another area of confusion a lot of times we hear is, well, I'm not getting a percentage of what's raised, right? I'm not getting 1% of every dollar coming in, but I'm going to get a year-end bonus that may go up or down with the amount of equity, may go up or down with, the profits of the enterprise, or I may just get a fixed number, but all I do all day long is try, are you kind of safe if you're not just getting a percentage of what's raised?
I mean, clearly the red flag goes when you're looking at an arrangement that has the typical commission percentage structure, but that's not the only concern. It's really tied to what activity is the person performing. And if that's a bonus or a fixed amount that's being paid for a brokerage service, that's still impermissible or will create the issue, the problem. And frankly, it doesn't even need to be cash. It could be that that person is receiving securities, and it doesn't even need to be upfront. It could be that that person is receiving a portion of the carried interest. So it is a bigger issue than just the straight transaction-based commission.
We're going to switch gears a little bit because we tend to hear this a lot and maybe see it less actually in practice, but we have a lot of people come to us and say, well, I've heard of an intra, or I'm not sure what that is, versus an interstate. Chip, can you highlight what they're talking about?
Basically, if an offering is really particular to a state and meets certain requirements, at least the federal level, then the securities in that offering are exempted from federal registration. And that's to be compared to what a lot or most private fund groups are doing, which is reaching out across multiple states to a variety of investors. And that takes you out of any sort of intrastate offering exemption. And if you do have an intrastate offering at federal level, there's no filing and there's no investor qualification requirements or limits on the amount that can be raised, but there are specific features that have to be abided by, including the offering has to be made only to residents in that state that you're offering in. And then generally the issuer has to meet some state-based criteria, such as having a certain amount of its assets or revenues in that state. And then it has to have its principal place of business in the state. And last but not least, that's the federal side. Depending on what state it is, you'll have to also navigate the state securities laws to figure out an exemption that works with the interstate exemption.
Yeah, so we're located here in Virginia. So, Rhys, any ideas about kind of Virginia?
Yes. So here, there are a number of exemptions that an issuer can look to under both the code and the regulations in Virginia. Some relate to numbers of purchasers, others to the mechanics of the offering. And then, of course, an issuer could always elect to register under Virginia's laws if offering solely in Virginia.
And occasionally we hear about California offerings. I guess that's probably just given population of the state that those tend to take off sometimes, Rhys.
To demonstrate one of the sometimes quirks of the federalist system, if you're in an interstate offering in California, harkening back to our discussion of payment of compensation, there's certain offering types related to real estate assets where if you're just in California and under the interstate exemption, real estate brokers can offer them in addition to licensed securities brokers, which is a pretty unique feature to California, but it's also obviously the largest and wealthiest state in the country. And so that's why part of why you may see some California only offerings.
So Chip, any major issues, or are we kind of just, you better get good advice, because if you don't follow the limited exemptions in these states, then all of a sudden you're back to federal.
Yeah, clearly a necessity. That I think some folks Google on the internet and figure out things like, at least at the federal level, general solicitation's not prohibited, but that they don't necessarily think that the matching state exemption may prohibit general solicitation. And you have issues related to the internet, which have become more flexible, and acknowledgement that the role that the internet has with the fund business, but you'll need to be mindful of designing it such that you're only taking offers from the residents in the state that you're looking to sell in. So there's certainly a bunch of traps to step through if you decide to go the interstate route.
That's great. That'll wrap up today's discussion on some additional aspects of raising capital. I thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, please contact me. You can also visit our web pages related to the Securities and Corporate Governance team, the REITs team, at williamsmullen.com. There you can find out more about the team, our legal alerts, and some of the recent representations we have undertaken. And finally, be sure to subscribe to this podcast to be notified when our next episode posts. Thanks for listening, and until next time.
This podcast contains general condensed summaries of actual legal matters, statutes, and opinions for information purposes. It is not meant to be and should not be construed as legal advice. Individuals with particular needs on specific issues should retain our services or the services of other competent counsel.